And thank you so much for joining us for tonight's Connected Conversation, a program conducted by the Idaho Humanities Council. If you're not familiar with our organization, I encourage you to check out our website, idahohumanities.org. I'd like to remind you all that you may submit any questions using the Q&A feature located at the bottom of the screen, and I cannot guarantee that any questions answered in the chat will be answered. With me tonight is Dr. Eric Hadley from Boise State University, and it's an honor to have you with us tonight. I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Doug. It's a pleasure to be here. I do have a Google slide presentation that you gave me sharing rights, I believe. Well, thank you, Doug, and thank you to the Idaho Humanities Council for inviting me. My name is Dr. Eric Hadley. I teach a variety of classes in the history department at Boise State University, including classes in European history, which is my specialty, to be honest. But one of my PhD fields was in a new field in the late 90s, early 2000s called the Atlantic world, in which we moved away from national histories and looked more regionally at continents, continent-wide histories and environmental histories and the role of indigenous peoples, and particularly the role of agency and power of indigenous peoples in over long periods of time, 400 or 500 years. And often starting with that, we would look before, we have these key dates like Columbus sailing, 1492. And then that somehow the narrative starts there in the Pacific and Hawaii, Captain Cook in 1788. And so the goal there was to move the narrative onto indigenous ground and start with that. And then, yes, we have this larger story of eventually Western European settler-colonial intervention, but to not grant power to that exclusively and say, and move this notion of the age of discovery and put quotations around it and say, maybe an age of encounter is a better term. Anyway, I've taught that for a number of years, and I got really interested in Pacific world and Pacific Islander histories, particularly in Hawaii as well. And so this is a challenge for me. This is my newest field, both teaching at Boise State and as an emerging research interest for myself, which is what I teach a class called the Pacific World at Boise State. And it centers more or less on Hawaii as a micro history of an indigenous Pacific people with a very particular special history, and also how their history tells us a wider narrative, a wider kind of meta narrative of Pacific world identity. So that's where this started. And this talk is kind of I guess the confluence of both of these, both Atlantic and Pacific world. I wanted to talk about the power of indigenous peoples in resisting the settler colonial narrative and hegemony. And I do that both kind of, I'm as guilty, I guess, even though I put things into Atlantic and Pacific, I didn't really put it into a world theory perspective. And I kept stumbling onto notions where I would see different indigenous groups working together for the same goal, for the same end. And so when I was asked if I would be interested in doing a presentation for the IHC, I thought, why not talk about something I've never actually presented on before? So this is a new thing for me, and that is the intersections of where American Indian and Native Hawaiian movements over land and sovereignty in the last 50 years have met these kind of confluences. And it's not always going to be in the same direction. They're not always necessarily working to the same goals, but they're definitely operating in conjunction with one another and lifting each other up. And so that's what I want to talk about. I will say at the outset, I think it's important to note I'm not Native Hawaiian, and I have no claim to speak for Native Hawaiians. I have a deep respect for Native Hawaiian culture, but I speak as an outsider. And so yeah, let's get started. So I'm gonna start here and bring this to Idaho. This is Dr. Lenata Warjack. She's a member of the Shoshone-Bannock tribe out of Fort Hall in eastern Idaho. This is a picture of her at Alcatraz in 1970. She's at Alcatraz because she, with a group of American Indian activists, had occupied Alcatraz the previous November, and would continue to do so for another year and a half. And that was this. If you know anything about the Alcatraz occupation, and I'll talk about it in greater detail shortly, it was the catalyst for a series of American Indian movement renaissance in the 1970s, and it was on the world stage. It was followed by the American media, and it was a nearly 20-month-long occupation, and that became the model in some ways for other indigenous groups to have similar, both the expression of resistance and the means of resistance to further indigenous causes. So I want to start with her. And this quote, which is a lengthy quote, you don't have to read it in its entirety, but it's a quote by the Kalahui Hawaii, which is a Hawaiian organization dedicated to Hawaiian sovereignty or Hawaiian independence of Native Hawaiians, and a reclamation of the Hawaiian archipelago for Native Hawaiians. And the title of this article was "The Next Step Towards Sovereignty, Project Hawaiian Justice." And what I thought was really interesting is it was a series of bullet points. And one of the bullet points, I think this was number 3, was working with American Indians and finding this commonality of experience, and this commonality of experience in the face of Western settler-colonial hegemony and racism and marginalization, and a loss of culture, a loss of language, and a realization that these goals can be met in an alliance or in solidarity with one another. And it's an article that clearly is tying Hawaiian sovereignty interests directly back to American Indian similar struggles over sovereignty and land. So the way this will work, I have a brief. My wife helped cut me this down because she said it was way too long, so I'll try to keep it brief. History of Native Hawaiians in the Hawaiian Kingdom, because I think it's really important, just like I was talking about with understanding, say, American Indian societies before Columbus or Hawaiian society before Cook. It's important to have some context or background to the struggle. And that many people don't really know that much about the history of Hawaii prior to Cook, and so we'll talk a bit about that, and then we'll talk about Hawaii in the 20th century, and then I have just 5 examples of indigenous agency, starting with the Alcatraz occupation of 1969, moving to the Kaho'olawe occupation, which is an island in Hawaii, and there's a direct consequence of Alcatraz. And then at the same time, the Hokulea, which is a wakamoana, double-hulled traditional Hawaiian sailing vessel that sails thousands of miles to Tahiti using traditional techniques in navigation for the first time in 600 years. And then 2 further examples more recently, the Standing Rock protests in North Dakota, and the Mauna Kea protest over the 30-meter telescope in 2015 and as recently as 2019. So that's my talk in a nutshell. Some terms I'm going to use and can reference back here. It's important to use the Hawaiian term. The Kanaka Maoli means the Native Hawaiian people. Ohana is family. Aina is land. To Malama Aina means to care for the land. To Aloha Aina is to love the land. It's necessary to be pono, that is to say righteous, or achieve some degree of reciprocity. And to provide kuelana, which is responsibility. And the kiai would be a guardian who is charged with the kuelana, the responsibility to do aloha aina and malama aina, to care and love the land. And it's up to an ohana group to do that. A couple other terms, an ahupua'a is a traditional land district, which references, and you can still see them today if you go to Hawaii, at least it designates where they are on signs. but they're like pie-shaped slices of traditional land under the traditional system before the overthrow, well, before the Great Mahele, and certainly before the overthrow of the monarchy. The Maka'ainana are people, but the common people, which is to be distinguished from the eli'i, or the leaders. And finally, much of what we understand, what I understand, comes from mo'olelos, and those are stories or histories that the Hawaiian people have preserved. And many of those are preserved through something that people most commonly associate when they think of Hawaiian culture, which is hula, mele, chanting, and they tell mo'olelos. And finally, mana, or power. Do this really quickly. So there are, anthropologists, archaeologists traced through pottery a group called the Lapita people from New Guinea to the Fiji, Tonga, Samoa region, where they arrived probably 3,000 years ago, at least, maybe earlier. For about 1,000 years, these people known as the Lapita stayed in that general area in the Western Pacific and they developed a distinctly Polynesian culture, language, and traditions. And this is known as, or one of the homeland idea of this would be Hawaii, and Hawaii is the Polynesian almost art garden of Eden, this place where Polynesian people came from. And the term Hawaii, you have the glottal stop where you replace the K. When these Polynesians arrived in the Hawaiian Islands, they named it that, Hawaii, this special place. And they did arrive. After about 1,000 years in the Fiji, Tonga, Samoa area, these Polynesian people who were very smart, very good navigators, very adept sailors, sailed thousands of miles across open ocean. And they encounter the Society Islands, or the Tahitian chain, the Tuamotus, the Marquesan chain, and eventually they moved northward into crossing the equator to the Hawaiian chain. They also find Rapa Nui, aka Easter Island, and Aotearoa, also known as New Zealand. And if you look at my little map here, you have this Polynesian triangle locked in on the far east by Rapa Nui, to the north by the Hawaiian Islands, and in the southwest by Aotearoa. And you can see the Samoa, Fiji, Tongan area here, which is the heart of the Lapita culture. In addition to reaching Rapa Nui, we know from a couple of reasons, a couple of ways that that Polynesian explorers also reached the coast of South America. We know that because they brought back sweet potatoes, and these sweet potatoes were then farmed throughout Polynesia, notably all the way to New Zealand, but in Hawaii, certainly. And most recently, they've done DNA testing of indigenous peoples in Rapa Nui and find similar DNA lines as people in the Peru-Bolivia area. So there was this connection, but there was no long-term settlement. The Polynesians remained an ocean and island people. So Hawaii was colonized during this time, between 500 and 1400 of the Common Era. When they colonized, they divided the land up into these things called ahupua'as, which would start at the top of the mountain and go down to the ocean. And each of these ahupua'as would be turned over to kinship groups of commoners known as the Maka'ainana to work it. They have a different notion of land ownership. The land is useful for its productive value, not in terms of its acreage, not in terms of its territory. The land is worked and is used for both livestock, and the Polynesian voyagers brought livestock with them, like pigs and chickens and dogs. But also they also brought plants with them, like taro, sweet potatoes, breadfruit, bananas, coconuts, and other. And so they would, and in addition, they created fish ponds, and these fish ponds were very sustainable. And there's an elite class over these people known as the ali'i, and a priest class, the kahunas. And both the ali'i and kahunas basically are able to live off of the productive excess of the ahupua'as. To keep the ahupua'as sustainable, they developed kapu laws, which would say don't overfish an area, don't overhunt an area, give the grounds a rest when it needs to be. And so you would put it off limits temporarily. Eventually, you see the development by the 1500s and 1600s of a high kingship. And these are known as ali'i nui, which would be a great king, or an ali'i akua, which would be a god king. And someone like Kamehameha I would certainly fit in that bill. It was forbidden by this point for the Maka'ainana to even look at them, let their shadow fall on them. They were required to give them tribute, but this tribute was supposed to be held in pono, meaning the ali'i had to be righteous. They had to aloha aina and allow the Maka'ainana to care for the land. So this is the system that Hawaii worked in. And we're talking going from maybe 400 to 500 colonists to a population of at least 500,000. And some have estimated upwards of 800,000 at the time of Captain Cook's arrival in 1778. Finally, there's a Makahiki season, which is a wintertime peace season when no war can happen and where the god Lono is the god of fertility and rain, is allowed to collect tribute for the ali'i. This is when the Maka'ainana would give what they had in tribute to the ali'i. This is the Hawaiian Islands. And this is 1778, Cook arrives and dies. We'll just move on from that. We don't have time, but Cook gets killed in an altercation on the Big Island at Kealakekua Bay. When his expedition returns back to London, unlike previous Pacific expeditions like the Spanish, who had not stumbled onto Hawaii, the London Royal Society made sure to publish these things. So all of a sudden Hawaii was on the map. And then with things like the fur trade and whaling, and missionaries became a very popular place subsequently. Notably, if you're in Idaho, you know the Owaihi River and the Owaihi mountain range, not too far from Boise. This is Owaihi, means Hawaii. And these are Hawaiians who were brought in by fur traders to work the inner rivers. And 3 Hawaiians were lost in the early 19th century, and thus Owaihi. So Idaho has that connection. To understand why Hawaiians, or how the language and culture and traditions that Hawaiians today use in resistance, it takes a little bit of background here. Kamehameha I is, I don't have time to go through all of the rulers of Hawaii, but Kamehameha is certainly worth noting, in part because he, using Western ships and weapons and even artillery and muskets, is able to he's the king of the Big Island of Hawaii, but he eventually conquers the rest of the archipelago. And he does this by around 1800, within 10, 12 years of Cook. And this is important. It's important for the purposes of this talk, which is he unifies Hawaii under a single kingship. And that means that Western people would have to deal with him, and they couldn't try to play one chieftain off against the other, which they had done very successfully in the Americas with both Mesoamericans and Native Americans, trying to divide and conquer and pull one tribe off to another tribe and get them to agree to terms of the treaty, which over people they didn't have power over, or to use those people in war against another. So Kamehameha, at a very key moment, unifies the island chain and prevents this from happening. There's no crack there for Westerners to exploit. There's Kamehameha. This is where he died in 1819 on the Big Island, in Kulua. After his death, you see an end. This is the beginning of change in Hawaii, and that's the end to traditional religious practices. His successor, a young man named Liholiho, is co-ruler with his stepmother, Kahu'umanu. And Kahu'umanu is successfully agrees to be converted to Christianity by the New England Board of Foreign Missions. And these are Congregationalists they're basically Puritans from New England. And they bring Christianity to the islands. Hiram Bingham is notably one of these, and with the conversion of Kahu'umanu, Kahu'umanu then convinces her stepson and ruler Liholiho to end the old ways and the worship of the Hawaiian gods, including Pele at Kilauea, and they end the kapu system, the system of taboos, which is the Tahitian word for kapu, which is the forbidding of things. And they do a certain Ainoa ritual, which is to say that men and women eat publicly together, and that's forbidden under Hawaiian law. And by doing that, it ends the forcible conversion, starting at the highest level of Hawaiian society, of people into Christianity. This is Queen Kahumanu and Hiram Bingham and some of the earliest churches. This is in Honolulu. Lihulihu dies young, and his younger brother, Keuli, takes control. He takes the title, obviously, Kamehameha III. And it's important to mention him for two reasons for the purposes of this talk, and that is the Great Mahele and the adoption of a parliament. He's convinced by these missionaries that if Hawaii wants to be a recognized kingdom on a global scale by Europeans, they have to do a British-style parliament with a constitutional monarchy, which he agrees to. And then later they also push him to go to a fee simple style land ownership, which means no longer ahu pua'as. It means we're going to take all the land and everybody gets title to it. Now you see the same struggle going on in Native American reservations with the notion of land being held by the tribe as a whole versus land being held individually, breaking up of the reservation and giving it to individuals. It's even worse in Hawaii in the Great Mahele. There's about 4 million acres of land in Hawaii, and they decide they'll divide it up in three: 1/3 to the king, 1/3 to the nobles, the elite, and some of these haole or white advisors, and 1/3 to the maka'inana, the commoners. But it doesn't work out that way. There are about 80,000 Native Hawaiians, so in population loss of 90% maybe by the mid-19th century. And the crown lands of about 1.8 million acres are held by the king, and the ali'i and the haules get their land, but only 1% of the maka'inana get land. It's about 28,000 acres. So this land, the point of this is this: when you go to Hawaii today, the state land and the federal land, that 1.8 million acres, is the crown lands of the king and of the monarchy. It goes back to this Great Mahele, and it's still being held in trust, and it has not been decided what to do with it. A new constitution is forced to the king in 1864 that reduces his power even more, and by people like this guy, Garrett King Judd, missionary here posing with two later Hawaiian kings. And finally, it comes to a head under David Kalakaua, the so-called marrying monarch. Kalakaua does his own version of a Hawaiian Renaissance. He wants to capture Hawaiian culture before it disappears. He has the Kumulipo recorded, which is the Hawaiian creation story, going back to the Genesis and all the way up, including Mauna Kea. And he does things like he builds a royal palace, the Iolani Palace in Honolulu. He brings back hula, which had been banned since 1830. He gets aborted genealogies together so that he can record the genealogies of the Ali'i Nui. And what you see here is he's negotiating between Western imperialism and the needs of Western imperialism that is being forced upon the islands, as well as a Native Hawaiian resurgence in cultural values. And so Kalakaua, he tries to do it both ways. But his work on Native Hawaiian agency backfires with the haules, who force the so-called Bayonet Constitution on Hawaii in 1887. By this point, the missionaries are second, third generation. They're very wealthy. They've taken over much of the land. They are royal advisors, and they basically force this constitution on the monarchy, which reduces the monarchy to a figurehead and disenfranchises Native Hawaiians and other Asian migrants. All power now goes to haules, who constitute less than 5% of the population. He dies, and his sister Liliuokalani takes power. This is the Honolulu Rifles, the Haole militia, enforcing the Bayonet Constitution. And Liliuokalani, she refuses the Bayonet Constitution. And in 1893, she calls for a new constitutional convention to go back to at least 1864, and preferably back to 1840. And what do the missionaries do? They convince John Stevens, who's the US minister to the Hawaiian Kingdom, to use American Marines on the USS Boston in Honolulu Harbor to occupy Iolani Palace and overthrow the Queen. And that's what happens. So these guys like Sanford Dole, the same family as Dole Pineapple. He'll become the president of a provisional Republic of Hawaii. And Hawaiians resist this. We have, they form a group called the Huli Hawaii Aloha Aina, and this group collects signatures to protest to Grover Cleveland, the president of the United States, saying, this isn't fair, this isn't right. And they collect 38,000 signatures of 40,000 registered adult Hawaiians. 38,000 of 40,000. And it works. There's been a lot of historical work on these petitions. And the petition is to go to the US government and say, what you did was illegal, and what you need to do is restore our independence. And actually, Cleveland agrees, and Congress does nothing. But in 1896, William McKinley is elected president. He's of a different party, he's a Republican, and more sympathetic to the notion of occupying and annexing Hawaii. And then the Spanish-American War happens of 1898, and the Americans decide, after capturing the Philippines from the Spanish, to keep it and not turn the Philippines back over as an independent country. And now Hawaii suddenly has a strategic resupply point. And it should be no coincidence then that the US government, in a simple majority vote, Congress just annexed Hawaii over the wishes of the Hawaiian people, over the wishes of the previous president. And Liliuokalani will die in 1917, and with her will die 1,000 more years of Hawaiian independence. So compare that brief history. It was probably too long, and I'm sorry, but I tried to cover the main points. You can look at that, and I've kind of put this here from between 1820 and 1898, and you can see how this works: the end of traditional religion, the banning of hula, the beginning of constitutionalism, the Great Mehele, the changing constitutions, the Bayonet Constitution, the overthrow of the monarchy, the banning of the Hawaiian language, and then annexation. And then you can also compare that to what is happening in the American West. In Idaho, Fort Hall and Fort Boise are established pretty early. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851, which includes Standing Rock land, is enacted and guarantees not just Standing Rock, but the land where the current DAPL pipeline is to the Standing Rock Sioux. In Colorado, the Sand Creek Massacre, Red Cloud's War, a second treaty, the Great Sioux War, Custer's Last Stand, the Nez Perce War, Geronimo, and then of course Wounded Knee. So you can see that these are happening roughly simultaneously in the American West and in Hawaii. All right, keep going here. So Hawaiian marginalization under Hales. Three things happen. Hawaiians are basically kicked off their own land, which is not dominated by a planter elite. They are removed from their own culture, both linguistically, traditionally, in terms of hula and other aspects. The Hale now dominate. And as a population, they're a minority in their own country, maybe 25%, 40,000 people in 1900 of roughly 160,000 people on the island. Actually, the largest group would be the Japanese at about 40%, and whites or Hales make up only 5%. So looking at Native American versus Hawaiian experiences, and only with an hour I can't get into all the details in this I'd like to talk about, but we do see one advantage that the Hawaiians have, and that is centralized authority. The Hales cannot pit these chiefs against one another. But you also see this wider Hawaiian identification with other Pacific peoples, particularly Polynesian peoples, Tongans, Samoans, Tahitians, Maori, and others, rather than continental American indigenous peoples like American Indians. And Hawaiian people are not recognized as a tribe or a nation. There are 573 recognized tribes through the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and the Hawaiian people are not one of them. And that's a sticking point even today. There's been no agreement by the federal government to recognize Hawaiian people as an indigenous self-governed entity. But despite that, we see some similarities here: the loss of sovereignty, the broken treaties, the dispossession of land, the loss of culture, forced schooling, vast depopulation, and marginalization, removal from political and economic power. This at statehood in 1959 gives you an idea of the Hawaiians, which is the lavender, versus the other ethnic groups in Hawaii. Hawaii changes quite a bit after the Second World War. We see changes in the sugar industry, which at this point they're producing more than 1 million pounds of sugar a year on over 200,000 acres. You see by 1960, America's getting 3/4 of its pineapples through Dole and Del Monte, also from Hawaii. You see a rise of Hawaiian tourism, this Pacific nostalgia of World War II soldiers mixed with commodification of things like tiki and surfing and hula. And vast militarization of Hawaii, almost 120 military sites and bases, 75,000 personnel, and head of the US Pacific Command. And so Hawaiian culture, in a sense, is there, but it's not, but it's being commodified, it's being objectified, and it's being used under a tourist gaze. Hawaiian land has never been really addressed. In the 1920s, under the territorial government, they set aside 200,000 acres of relatively poor land, not the stuff that they're, on beaches or growing sugar on. They established a blood quantum requirement. You had to be at least half Native Hawaiian. And yet, as of 2000, there's over 20,000 people on a waiting list, and they have yet to distribute 90% of this acreage. And on statehood, states adopted basically a guardianship of Native Hawaiians. They're wards of the state. They can't sue the state or the federal government for violation of those rights. And there's no bilateral recognition of Hawaiians. What they receive is 1/5 interest in proceeds of this quote unquote ceded lands. And that is this 1.8 million acres of crown and government lands that go back to the coup. This is an example from the Honolulu magazine of white people utilizing Hawaiian tropes of culture in terms of luau and hula without any basic understanding or necessarily appreciation for it. It's an objectification of Hawaiian culture. So we're almost to Alcatraz. By the 1970s, late 60s, you see the near disappearance of Hawaiian language and culture, this vast commodification, the exclusion of Hawaiians from lands. Most land is owned by Hale corporations. For instance, Lanai. Lanai is an island next to Kaʻalave and Molokai. And it was owned, basically all of it, by one of the big 5 sugar companies. Today, it's owned by Larry Ellison, like 98% of it. So how have things changed? It's still held in Hale hands. It's still privatized. So I'm going to talk about 3 examples now: Alcatraz, Kaʻalave, and the Hokulea. So this is one of the best pictures of the Alcatraz occupiers. And so the catalyst for this was the destruction of an American Indian cultural center in San Francisco, burned down. And searching for another opportunity, 3 American Indian leaders, Richard Oates, Lenata Warjack of Idaho, and Adam Fortunate Eagle, came across the Treaty of Fort Laramie of 1868. And it said in there that Indians could occupy abandoned federal lands. And Alcatraz had been abandoned for 5 years. And so in November of that year, 89, American Indians, under the title of the Indians of all tribes, not a single tribe, occupied Alcatraz. And by Thanksgiving or unthanksgiving or Indigenous Peoples Day, it would be 400 people. And what they did was really important. They set up a school and they taught non-white history. They set up a medical clinic. They set up a kitchen, living quarters, a cultural center. And it was more than just occupation, it was a re-education. It was a statement of Native cultural values and of pride that we can speak our language. We can dress in our traditional costumes or clothing. We can worship as we see fit, and we can remember our own history. And we can remember our history in a way that doesn't legitimize a settler-colonial narrative. After 2 years of a standoff with the Coast Guard and Richard Nixon, most of the people finally leave, and then power and water is cut off, and it ends. But it energizes American Indian resistance. Within a year later, the trail of broken treaties is taken to Washington, D.C., American Indian caravan and protest movement going to Washington with all the treaties that the American government had broken. The Wounded Knee occupation would occur the following year, 1973, where American Indian movement activists would make an armed occupation of the site at the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, where Wounded Knee had occurred. And so you see this, it becomes this really big deal. It's an important moment. If you go to Alcatraz today, it's a park, and it's still, you can see the Indians welcome in Indian land signs there. A direct consequence of that, Native Hawaiians utilize this same notion of occupying land, federal land. And a guy named Walter Ritt, along with 8 others, including an American Indian, Carla Villalaba of the Muckleshoot tribe of the Pacific Northwest, decide to occupy Kaho'olawe Island. And Kaho'olawe is this tiny little island. We're the only unoccupied, in the sense that there's no permanent human settlement there now. And from World War II through the Vietnam War, it was used as a bombing range by the US Navy. In addition, there were thousands of feral goats and sheep which had eaten everything and reduced it to a severely eroded place. It also is sacred. There's a spot at the south end of that island where there's a heiau, a temple, a navigational temple that takes you to Tahiti, and where Polynesian colonists may have stepped foot first when they arrived in the Hawaiian Islands, the quote unquote Plymouth Rock of Hawaiian colonists. And so the Navy had basically taken it over and was desecrating it, was bombing it, including enormous bombs, thousands of tons of TNT, which were supposed to simulate tactical nuclear weapons. So there's potholed and cratered and unexplored ordnance everywhere. And so these men and women who were inspired by Alcatraz occupied this area, and it worked. By 1980, federal court ruled joint use between Native Hawaiians and the US Navy. By 1990, live fire ends at Kaho'olawe. In 1994, the Navy turns the island in its entirety back over to the state for the use of Native Hawaiians. See a couple questions. Maybe, but I'll address those at the end if that's all right. But so you guys can keep putting questions in, and I'll deal with them as we go, so I can get through this quickly. So this is military detonations on Kaho'olawe. Here's Walter Ritt. Second example, the Hokulea. Hokulea is a traditional voyaging canoe, and so if people are familiar with the Kantiki Expedition post-war, like in 1948, it was this idea by these Norwegian and Swedes led by Genim Thor Heyerdahl that maybe colonization of Oceania happened from the east on balsa wood rafts coming from Peru, and he does one to prove it can happen, but it's deeply insulting. It suggests that there's no intentionality to navigation, that Polynesians couldn't do this. Plus, it breaks with everything we know about linguistics, archaeology, ethnography, and the mo'olelos, or stories that Polynesian people told. And so the Hokulea Expedition starts with the Polynesian Voyaging Society, in which they decide they're going to build a traditional canoe, and then they're going to sail it. And they're going to sail it using tradition, meaning they're not going to use, certainly not GPS and not even a compass. But they don't have any Poa navigators left. The art had been lost. So they have to go to Satawal in the Caroline Islands, and found Mau Piulug, who agreed to teach them how to navigate by the stars. And star navigation means you're pulling stars from the horizon all night long to hold a bearing, dead reckoning straight bearing line. And they do it. In 1976, they voyage from Hawaii to Tahiti. They're met by nearly 1/2 of the Tahitian population. And it's this amazing moment, this first time in 600 years that a traditional Polynesian canoe has sailed across the open ocean with traditional techniques and made it with Native Hawaiians on board. There are later voyages, and one I'll talk about maybe if I have time later, but notably the 1978 tragedy of Eddie Aikau, who was a member of that. And Eddie Aikau is a very famous Native Hawaiian surfer He had won the 1977 Duke Hanamoku Invitational, and subsequently served on the Hokulea when it capsized off of Lanai. And he tried to use a surfboard to sail or to swim for help, and he was lost at sea. This is of that first voyage, Nainoa Thompson, who is still with the Hokulea and the Polynesian Voyaging Society, and the Hokulea, Tahiti, and Eddie. So we have this renaissance, and it culminates in this rebirth of Hawaiian culture and language and traditions. When we see the establishment of halau hulas, or notably, like for instance, the Merry Monarch Festival. It starts in Hilo in 1963 as a tourist attraction, but by the 1970s has been converted to an actual traditional, authentic, competitive, both men and women's hula. And you see the establishment in Hawaii of the state and a constitution in 1978 that makes the Hawaiian language a state language again, and creates the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, which is basically tasked with being a representative and intermediary for Native Hawaiian peoples to the state government, and also, in theory, to deal with the proceeds from these lands that have never formally been dealt with. In 1993, you see the 100th anniversary of the overthrow of the monarchy and the origins really of a Hawaiian sovereignty movement. Kalahui Hawaii, founded in 1987 with 20,000 members. And so this is a sovereignty movement like independent Hawaii, leave the union, become an independent kingdom again. There's the Merry Monarch Festival in Hilo. I've only got a couple more minutes, so this leads to what we call second wave Renaissance. And if this first wave, roughly from the late 60s to the early 2000s, results in these big accomplishments for both Native Americans and Hawaiians in culture, the second one is centered on things like sovereignty and land stewardship. And you have things like a second voyage of the Hokulea, which is a worldwide voyage. It travels, you can see on my map here, around the entire world. And then notably, it goes up and down the east coast of the United States and meets not with politicians, not with haole or white politicians, but with Native peoples. In Jamestown, Virginia, the home of the first permanent white English settlement in Virginia, they meet there with the local Indian tribe and ask permission to come ashore. They don't meet with settlers, white settlers. And so you begin to see this notion of indigenous peoples sharing a common experience and doing it through ritual, doing it through music and dance and chants. And the Hokulea becomes not just a vehicle of Hawaiian indigenous identity, but it in some ways speaks for all indigenous peoples. You can watch a documentary on it. There's Mauna Kea by Nahalehu and Anthony. There's a really good documentary on that worldwide voyage. A second is Mauna Kea. Kea is over 33,000 feet from its base to its summit. That makes it the tallest mountain on the planet, if not the highest. The top third of it, about 13,796 feet, are above sea level. And this, in Hawaiian traditions, is considered the birthplace of the Hawaiian people. And you see this going back to the Merry Monarch himself, the Kumulipo. On the summit of Mauna Kea, or Mauna Wakea, is where Mother Earth and Father Sky had a daughter. So we say Mauna Kea, which means the White Mountain, but you could also translate it as Mauna Wakea, the home of the Sky Father. And this daughter had a stillborn son who she buried in the corner of the house, and a shoot came up out of the ground, and that was a taro shoot, and that feeds the Hawaiian people. And her second son is the first ali'i and the beginning of all humans. So it's a very special, this is like a Garden of Eden special place. It's considered an umbilical cord linking the heavens to the ground and the beginnings of Hawaiian people for all the islands. It has a sacred lake, Waio, which is one of the highest lakes in the United States, one of the only lakes in the Hawaiian island chain, and it's pre-19 or 1819. It was reserved, that entire summit, just for the ali'i and the kahunas, or the chiefs. These are pictures my son took on a trip that where we hiked up to the top of Mauna Kea. And it is very, it feels very otherworldly. You approach that, if you ever do this climb, do it in silence, do it with respect. There's me. And this is the Lake Waio. And if you are not Hawaiian, you don't touch that water, you don't approach it. I sat down and gazed, and I did take a picture, and then I turned around and walked back down. So on Mauna Kea are a series of observatories, and the construction started in the late 70s or late 60s. And there's about 13 of them. The entire summit is rented by the University of Hawaii, Hilo. My son, who made it further than I did, was able to take pictures of some of these observatories on the summit. Right now, there's proposed to be a new observatory placed on it, known as the 30-meter telescope. This is an artistic rendering of what it would look like, a very, very, very large telescope. And people the native community was more or less overlooked when planning for this was established. The permitting didn't take into account Native Hawaiian concerns about continued construction of objects on the top of the summit. And in the summer of 2015, the Kiai Mauna, a collective organization which involves both kapunas and Kiai, or guardians, blocked the road, the access road. And they followed a similar pattern that we saw with both Kaulale and with Alcatraz, in the sense that they build clinics and schools and kitchen and living quarters and teach hula and mele. They create a hula university. They make it a place of refuge, Puna Honua, where they teach cultural studies. And so on the one hand, you have this standoff with state and federal authorities and arrests of kapunas and of kiai. On the other hand, you have this widespread expression of Hawaiian identity at this sacred place. Here's the demonstrations. Kealoha Piskiota is one of the women leading the resistance. Another is a woman named Kua Case. And both of these women are prominent not just at Mauna Kea, but subsequently at Standing Rock the next year. And maybe you know more about Standing Rock. It's basically a Dakota Access Pipeline that was going to bring oil from North Dakota down to Illinois, and it would cross the very corner of, it doesn't actually cross onto reservation land, but it crosses right next to it and crosses the Missouri River. And a disruption of that pipeline would, first, it would go through burial and sacred areas, and second, a disruption of the pipeline would destroy the water. And you see a similar thing going on there, widespread occupation of construction areas and roads by indigenous peoples, the creation of camps that aren't just camps for the notion of blocking roads and doing a demonstration, but also a culture vitality of creating a space for medicine, for religion, for education. And it worked, or almost worked. By December of 2016, the Army Corps of Engineers halted construction and was going back to do another environmental survey. That ended when President Trump took office, and 4 days into office ordered the Army to finish the pipeline over all protests. But it suggests the power of these movements. And at Standing Rock, you had over 300 Native American tribes, but you also had Kumapua Case, who was a 30-meter telescope plaintiff. She brought her entire ohana. Kealoha also pledged support on behalf of 5 different organizations. Even the Office of Hawaiian Affairs offered support. And the reverse we begin to see is true as well. The National Congress for American Indians issued support and amicus briefs for the Mauna Kea protesters. So you begin to see how American Indians and Native Hawaiians are showing up and working directly with one another. Here's Standing Rock. Here's Andre Perez, a Native Hawaiian at Standing Rock. And I guess my last point, because I've got to wrap this up, is why oppose astronomy? This is how it's posed. I mean, this notion that it's a benign science, it's passive, it grants knowledge to people. Or you could recast it as, why are Native Hawaiians standing in the way of discovery? Why don't they want jobs? Why don't they want these things? Some critics even cast Native Hawaiian resistance as anti-science, comparing them to basically the Catholic Church and the Inquisition attacking Galileo. And what I would argue in brief is that this settler victimhood, it casts the settlers as somehow victims to the same notions of superstition or barbarism that we could go back to Hiram Bingham with from 1820. And it ignores or dehistoricizes indigenous land and power struggles over hundreds of years, and recasts it in some sort of immediate, well, why would you stand in the way of this progress? Today, you have a split in the Native Hawaiian community, not just on the issue of the TMT, although it seems increasingly more in recent polling that Native Hawaiians oppose the TMT than maybe 10 years ago, but also the notion of sovereignty. On the table right now is a bill that would allow Native Hawaiians to organize and achieve federal recognition as an entity, and they can determine the nature of that entity, but it doesn't grant independence. And so it's in limbo, because many of the same people who are opposing the TMT, who are standing at Standing Rock, are also saying, why should we take a bad deal? If we take a bad deal, we'll never get a good deal. And we see that with the Akaka bill, a 10-year struggle, which basically would have given Native Hawaiians the same rights as Native Americans in terms of tribal recognition. But Native Hawaiians aren't content with merely recognition. And in this recognition, nothing is ever addressed on the 1.8 million acres that was stolen. Has never even been returned. And so nationalists like Hanani K. Trask say, we are not going to compromise, and we've got a long game here, and we're winning this game. So you can say the starting point of this is to say that if you want the TMT, then you have to negotiate with Native Hawaiians as equals, and say, we understand that at the basis of this negotiation, you may say no and never say yes. And none of those negotiations have ever gone that direction. They've never started with the notion of, it's not, no is not an option. It's always, what would you need? What do you need? What do you need? And that doesn't, it is a different, it doesn't have the violence of the 1893 overthrow, but it has the same invectives of settler-colonial superiority and racism to say that you don't have the knowledge or capacity or wherewithal to understand the value of this place. And it also is, it's a land grab in a sense. The conclusion of this is really intersectionality, and the intersectionality is looking at solidarities with American Indian movements on all of these examples, with between mainland indigenous peoples, including Native Hawaiians in the diaspora. Those 40% of Native Hawaiians don't live in Hawaii, they live mostly in the mainland United States, including in places like Salt Lake and in Boise, and places like Iosepa, which is a old Hawaiian community in the west of Salt Lake that is still cared for and maintained by not just Hawaiians, but Polynesian descendants. They take care of the graves there of the ancestors. And yet that in of itself is next to Goshu tribal land of Native Americans. And so you can see at Iosepa this confluence of Native Americans, Native Hawaiians, and commemoration of one's identity and how these different identities can operate. You also see the role of indigenous peoples and women in leadership positions, from Dr. Lenata Warjack to Kumapua Case to others. The prominence of women is really significant here. So here, that's a picture from one of my graduate students, Frederick Johnson, who's doing work on Iosepa. He went down there to take pictures of that community and doing a protest, not in Hawaii, but in Utah. And here's one of the Idaho Hawaiian group on Facebook, who organized a protest at the Albertson Stadium at Boise State, also to protest the TMT, which tells you that this notion of solidarity is not restricted to a single island chain or to a single indigenous group, but is spread amongst them. So thank you. I can take questions now.
Yeah, thank you for such a wonderful presentation. And we are going to stay on for about 15 minutes for the Q&A, so we will be running a little bit past that 7 o'clock deadline. But also you did have a lot to cover with the history of Hawaii. So I applaud you for being able to do it in such a short amount of time. So the first question we have is, since the conversion of Christianity was led by the Queen of Hawaii, did the Hawaiians readily abandon the traditional beliefs, or was there, resistance, even though it was coming from the Queen, in that top-down kind of structure?
That's a great question. And it has no short answer. Yes, there was resistance. At the time that it happened, there was actually a rebellion of priests on the Big Island against the imposition of Christianity, but they were ultimately they were pushed down. And it's a complicated question because you can argue that that these beliefs are not in a binary system, that you could adopt Christianity and what's to say someone fully adopts Christianity just because someone says they showed up at a church. That doesn't mean that they necessarily are giving up native belief systems. And these native belief systems can exist simultaneously and have both in some ways. So that's a good question. I wish as much as some of my students call me a pumu or a teacher, I'm also a Hamana, a student, and that's something I don't know as much about in terms of the 19th century versions of it. But yeah, there was not a fast process, I would argue that.
And what was the relationship between the Japanese immigrants and the Native Hawaiians on the island?
That's another good one. So Japanese immigrants are brought in primarily as laborers, agricultural laborers, particularly to work in the sugar fields. And they initially stay very closely to themselves, meaning that they marry other Japanese and stick within a Japanese community. There are moments of overlap and crossover. For instance, at the time of the 1864 Constitution leading to the Bayonet Constitution, there is increasing voting solidarity amongst Asian migrants and the Hawaiian community against the Hale minority. And for instance, another example would be you see Japanese immigrants going on strike before World War II for better pay and working conditions, and that's being supported by Native Hawaiians as well. So there are connections between the two. And then later on, the question of who is a Hawaiian is a complicated one. I would argue you have to be of the Kanaka Maoli, you have to be of Hawaiian ethnicity, but there are many people who are part Japanese, part Chinese, part Hawaiian today. It's not an exclusive community anymore. And for instance, the governor today, Ige, he's of Japanese descent, and so was Daniel Inouye, the World War II veteran, Japanese American, who fought quite hard on behalf of Native Hawaiians, but in this way of not sovereignty, but within the bounds of federalism.
And since the percentage of Hawaiians on the island is actually relatively small compared to the rest of the population on the island and in the US, how are the efforts to reclaim not only their culture but also their lands kind of being perceived, in the greater US?
Okay, that's a good one as well.
Getting all the good ones tonight.
I can't, as I said at the beginning, I won't speak for necessarily for Native Hawaiians. There is a split. There is a group. I mean, Senator Akaka, who is of Hawaiian descent himself, is the one who introduced this federal recognition bill, which is a compromise bill. It basically puts Native Hawaiians on par with Native Americans in terms of the BIA. And so there's a split between those who would support this kind of centrist approach of we need to get something, we need to have some sort of settlement, we need federal recognition, and we need to accept that maybe we're never going to get the 1.8 million acres back. And then there's the group that we've seen, like with the TMT, on those supporting Standing Rock and others, who say, no, why would we, if the coup of 1893 is illegal, and then everything that follows from it is illegal. Nothing, you can't sell me stolen land. You can't offer me 10% of land when you stole 100% of it. And so I would, in my observation of how the community has been debating, there's no clear direction forward right now because the sovereignty movement is demanding something that the federal government isn't allowing. And then you also have to fundamentally at some point, I would argue, you probably would have to deal with the fact that there are obviously large groups, 80% of the population of Hawaii today is non-Hawaiian. That doesn't mean that they don't sympathize with or identify with the goals of the Native movement. But it's a really complicated issue that has no clear solution.
Yeah, and as you touched on earlier, with the sovereignty movements and other indigenous movements, Hawaiians kind of tend to have more of a can't think of the right word, but they kind of identify more with like Polynesian culture as a whole, rather than other indigenous tribes in the continental US. So do you think that kind of, I don't want to call it a rift, because as you've shown, it's definitely not, rift in a negative way, but that cultural difference, has that impacted, either moves for sovereignty on Hawaii's part, or, just kind of Hawaiian perception, in these roles?
Yeah, I mean, so traditionally, and we can see this going back to King David Kalakaua and others, that Hawaiians were seeking, both as an independent kingdom and then post-overthrow, to create these wider connections with other Polynesians. And you could see that with my experience with the Polynesian community here in Boise or in the Salt Lake community. And you see that with the question about the flags. If you go to Yosepa, my graduate student, Patrick Johnson's doing some really, really important work there. And you see pictures of behind the graves of the ancestors of these kupunas are the flags of Samoa and the flags of Tahiti and of New Zealand, and all of these different Polynesian communities are represented. And so the reason I gave this talk was because I was moving past the notion that it was a pan-Polynesian identity, which is important. And that's what the Hokulea really connected back to, was this pan-Polynesian identity and this shared experience of island people in the Pacific with imperialism, with settler colonialism. But also this increasing connection to the mainland. And it comes in two directions. It comes with the diaspora of Native Hawaiians living in the American West. In places like Boise or California, in Nevada, there's a very large Hawaiian community. In Salt Lake, there's an enormous Polynesian community. But also to Native Americans, to the American Indian, and you see that, and you can see it at these key points, like at Standing Rock, that it's not just about Polynesians standing as Polynesians. It's about indigenous peoples standing with other indigenous peoples and playing off of one another's movements. In fact, Kumapua case, another former student at Boise State got in touch with me last week and was talking about my Pacific World class. His name's Nick Beluzzo, and he's doing his PhD at the College of William and Mary, and he did a really nice job of translating a mele for me from Kumapua case, and it's a mele that she had written for Mauna Kea, but then rewrote it for Standing Rock. And she brings Standing Rock into it, and water protectors, which are similar to the Kiai, the guardian protectors at Mauna Kea. So she rewrites this. This is her mele, and then she goes and sings it at Standing Rock. And so it complicates this notion of indigeneity and solidarity, that we can move beyond the Polynesian connection to this American connection.
Yeah, and I think, tying into that, it's also kind of that perspective of we are a state in the United States. It makes sense for us to be involved in these other Native movements, since we have a similar perspective, of colonialism and stuff like that, with the fact that they were annexed essentially into the U.S.
But yeah, if you go back to that first quote on that presentation, and I can give you a copy of that presentation if people want to look at it. But that quote really says, Native American tribes are fully aware of the incompetencies and corruptions that have occurred both in tribal government level and at the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And using that knowledge, using that experience, they can stand shoulder to shoulder with Native Hawaiian organizations and say, you can ask for a better deal than the one that's being offered, and beware what seems too good probably is. And so there is this that one thing that Samoans, Tongans, Tahitians, and other Polynesian communities are not necessarily, well, the Samoans are, the American Samoans are, but outside of the American Samoans, none of these other Polynesian communities are not directly dealing with the United States government, the federal government, and American Indians have been and continue to do so.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier that all Native Hawaiians are, essentially wards of the state of Hawaii. And because of that, they can't sue not only the state government, they also can't sue the federal government. Is that something that is like unique to the Native Hawaiian experience, or is that also part of like the Native American tribes in the continental US? Because that was just something that struck me. It's really interesting.
I believe, and anyone on the call can correct me if I'm wrong, I believe it is unique. So when I mean sue, I don't mean like you can't sue in any court that you don't, but it means that in terms of say, speaking on behalf of Native Hawaiians or speaking on behalf of Hawaiian lands, you can't sue for that. Now, we have seen different groups in federal court actually do. There are suits that have been brought up about TMT. There are suits that have been brought up about the Kaulave. So it's not to suggest that you are considered a permanent ward of the state, but the Native Hawaiian people as a community have no legal standing to speak as a group before state or federal government, because there's no recognition of them as a legal organization akin to a tribe. The way a tribe can, Shoshone-Bannock tribe or the Nez Perce tribe can sue in federal court as a tribe. The Hawaiians don't have that right. And I think that's relatively, there may be other groups, if you look at Puerto Rico or Guam or something, you might see similar things, but as a native or indigenous group, it's relatively rare.
And do you think that was partially due to the fact that Cleveland, found the annexation process, of Hawaii kind of illegal? Do you think that was like a way for the federal government to maybe protect themselves in a little bit, since they didn't offer Hawaii the same status as indigenous tribes in America?
Yeah, that's why I spent a little more time, maybe more time than I should have, on the history part of things, is to point out in some ways why it is so exceptional that we can see these connections today, because the history in some ways was very different. That you have a single monarchy, which is internationally recognized by the British, by the French, by the Japanese, by all these other countries as an actual country. And that's not to say that Native Americans didn't occasionally achieve that as well. But in general, you can look at most of the American West, in which from the time of the Louisiana Purchase, they are viewing Native Americans as basically occupiers of land that is under the jurisdiction of the American government. And thus they can't ever, and still today, a tribal government can't ask for sovereignty. It can't be identified. It can, you can make them tax-free, or you can build a casino, you can have tribal police, you can do all these things, but you don't get to say, and now we're going to open an embassy and invite the British in, we're going to join the United Nations and we're a new country. And so that's something that's different. The Hawaiians had that. And so when they come in, when they're forcibly annexed, and the troubles with the whole annexation treaty and how it fails, and how one American president calls it illegal, how the initial annexation falls apart, and it's only after the Spanish-American War and a change in administration. So you see that happen, just like you see it happening at Standing Rock. A change in administration is what fundamentally leads to this the collapse of a native claim here. And in doing so, yes, they annex the Hawaiian Islands, but never address the Hawaiians, the Native Hawaiians as a group. And in part because the Haules, the white people, had taken over, they'd taken over the government. So if you were to say, well, with a tribe, well, we have Native tribe elders, men and women speaking on behalf of this tribe, it's not a bunch of third generation white guys doing it. And that's what happens in Hawaii, is they overthrow the government and then claim it. And they claim to they take the lands. Now they try to wash their hands of it, and when annexation occurs, they turn all the crown lands over to the feds and to the state, and so it looks like they're not actually benefiting from it, but they are, because they lease it. And so it's a peculiar aspect of history that the Native Hawaiians, unlike other groups, are never given formal recognition as an indigenous people the way others are.
Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for tonight. So I did want to say thank you again, Dr. Hadley, for being with me tonight and giving us that wonderful brief overview of Hawaiian history and all the different movements. I think you did a really good job showing those connections, outside of the Polynesian world, because I did take your Pacific World class. So in that class, we definitely talked a lot about those connections. So I think you really showed the other side of that coin with the connections to the indigenous tribes in the US.
Well, Doug, it was a pleasure, and thank you very much for inviting me, and to everyone on this call. Feel free to email me with any questions. It's very simple, Eric Hadley at boisestate.edu. And thank you for your time tonight.
Yeah, have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.